Time Machine, brought to you in part by Lincoln Automobiles.
We shall continue to make concrete and realistic proposals for disarmament.
As an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Make no attacks on North Vietnam.
Learn to live together or we have to die together.
Saigon, and I mean Hitler.
The aggressive impulses of an evil empire. What was it?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Let's negotiate this thing out because you're not going to bury us.
Hello and welcome. This is David Frost in Berlin. In the course of the next 2 hours, we shall be tracing the course of this nation's longest-running conflict, the Cold War. World War II was nearly over. Much of Europe had been devastated, left in ruins. Governments had collapsed. Economies were in shambles. Infrastructures had unraveled. Europe would need to be reorganized, a job left to the Allied powers. February 1945, with victory in sight, Winston Churchill, a frail Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Russian dictator Joseph Stalin met in the resort town of Yalta on the Crimean Sea, guests of Stalin. The agenda? Stability in Europe after nearly 5 years of carnage. Hopes ran high for a new era of peace between the Soviet Union and the United States. Would it happen? Or was a new conflict on the horizon? We turn to noted historian Michael Beschloss for perspective on these events.
At the time that Roosevelt and Stalin met at Yalta in the spring of 1945, you had two absolutely opposing views. Stalin was determined to create a buffer zone in Europe. Roosevelt wanted a Europe whole and free that would be dominated by governments democratically arrived at.
It was during 1945 that tensions started to mount. 3 months after Yalta, Soviet forces had taken Berlin and Nazi Germany was defeated. But even as the peace treaty was being signed, distant rumblings of a new battle could be heard. A battle between communism and democracy. Throughout this program, we'll look back at the key moments of the Cold War through the eyes of some of the leaders who fought it. We caught up with President George Bush, appropriately enough, in Moscow. Do you remember those days of the Cold War when these very serious-looking men stood in a line reviewing the troops as they came through here? Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
The West did not quite know what to expect from their Russian allies.
They became friends when Germany broke the pact and invaded them. Then we were kind of on their side. We didn't know much about them. We didn't like the totalitarian system. But the enemy of your enemy is your friend, and thus we saw them as friends.
And as former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher told me, from the start there were grave suspicions about the entire Soviet system.
How could you ever have a self-appointed group of people, the Marxists and the Leninists, saying to all the rest of the people, you cannot have your freedom?
But there were persuasive leaders like Fidel Castro who believed communism, or socialism, offered people the best hope for equality.
Now there are 2, 3, 4, 5 types of communism or socialism. Good socialism and bad socialism. Ours is the bad socialism. It has been so decreed by the materials.
It all began just 30 miles south of here in a small suburb called Potsdam, where the allies of World War II met and decided the fate of Europe by dividing it into zones of east-west influence, as first proposed at Yalta. By now, it was July 1945, but Roosevelt was dead, replaced here by Truman, and during the meeting, Churchill lost his re-election bid and had to return to Britain. So at the end of the three leaders who had met in Yalta, only Stalin remained.
Stalin felt that unless there were friendly governments around his border in Europe, he would be as insecure as he was before and during World War II. That was a nightmare he'd never wanted to live through again. That absolutely clashed with the will of the United States.
But democracy throughout Europe would be difficult to attain, a fact first acknowledged by Winston Churchill in his prophetic speech given at Fulton College in Missouri on March the 5th, 1946.
Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Churchill's speech was a very big alarm bell to Americans because many Americans, as late as March of 1946, still thought of the Soviets as allies. So it was left to the former British Prime Minister, the great war leader, Winston Churchill, to be the one to give this speech saying that an iron curtain is descending across Europe, and we in the West are going to have to fight the Soviet Union tooth and nail for conceivably our lifetimes and beyond.
Then, of course, when World War II ended and Eastern Europe was kind of divided up and handed to Russia, we clearly saw, everybody clearly saw Russia not as a friend, but as an enemy.
The doctrine of Lenin, which is, as you may recall, probe with bayonets. If you encounter mush, proceed. If you encounter steel, withdraw. That's the way the communist leaders will be. Because as communists, they have to go forward with spreading the gospel. That's what they believe. They want just not a communist Russia or what have you, they want a communist world.
But as Europe and the rest of the world were being reassembled, would Marxist-inspired economies work? The world would soon find out. But Truman realized that Europe could not be left to its own devices. Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, had developed a plan to assist the Western democracies with financial aid and technical expertise. The Marshall Plan proved to be a great success. In Russia, Stalin came up with a 5-year plan to rebuild their economy. But George Kennan, one of the architects of America's Cold War strategy, suggested that Stalin was also bent on aggressively expanding Soviet influence around the globe.
At the beginning of all this Cold War, there was a ruthlessness and a totalitarian excess that nobody could condone.
Communist insurgents became active throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Truman decided to act.
I therefore ask the Congress to provide authority for assistance to Greece and Turkey in the amount of $400 million.
The Truman Doctrine, in a way, was the moment of no return. That was the moment, essentially, when Harry Truman said, Franklin Roosevelt's dream of post-war cooperation between the Soviets and the British and the Americans is dead, and we're going to have to act fast to prevent the overthrow of all sorts of governments in Europe that could very quickly create a Soviet fortress Europe.
The escalating tensions between East and West were nowhere felt more clearly than in Berlin, now divided into 4 zones. In March of 1948, the Western powers combined their occupation zones into one economic union. Stalin was furious with the West. Almost overnight, a vast blockade was thrown around the areas of Berlin held by the Western powers. But Britain and the United States were determined to make a stand. They began a huge airlift. Once the Berlin airlift was underway, a cargo plane touched down every 3 minutes. For nearly a year, the planes ferried more than 2 million tons of supplies to the city. West Berlin survived, and finally on May the 12th, 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade. It was a small victory, but it marked the first direct action taken by the United States to stop Soviet expansion in Europe. Elsewhere, communism was on the march.
Inside the Cold War with Sir David Frost will continue. We now return to Inside the Cold War.
In the years since 1948, the small enclave of West Berlin had remained a lightning rod of East-West relations. And as tensions mounted, it became clear that Berlin was just the beginning. In 1945, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria became communist. Albania and Poland were not far behind. In 1947, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. And in 1949, East Germany completed the Eastern Bloc. Tensions were growing. In China in 1949, communist soldiers under Mao Zedong defeated nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek.
The Soviets were glad to see a revolution in China in 1949, but they sure weren't responsible. This was a civil war. There was a conflict between the government of Chiang Kai-shek and the forces of Mao that went back for many years. They suspended it for World War II, and then after the war, Mao's forces drove to victory, and you had a communist regime in 1949.
Meanwhile, in the West, the Truman Doctrine paved the way for NATO, formed in April 1949, an alliance to protect the free nations of Europe. In response, the Soviets formed their equivalent, the Warsaw Pact. Elsewhere, the communist revolution was spreading. On June the 25th, 1950, North Korea used Soviet-supplied weapons to stage a sudden attack on South Korea. American forces counterattacked. Truman then turned to the 70-year-old General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific in World War II. Under the banner of the recently formed United Nations, MacArthur staged a surprise landing near Incheon. Next, MacArthur took the capital, Pyongyang, and kept moving north, soon threatening the Chinese border near the Yalu River. The Chinese counterattacked. Then MacArthur overplayed his hand, publicly proposing to bomb North Korean supply bases in China, defying U.S. policy. Truman was furious.
A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
At last, on July the 27th, 1953, after 3 years of battle, an armistice was signed. Both Koreas moved back to the ceasefire line near the 38th parallel. But while battles had ceased in Korea, tensions were mounting in Moscow. Stalin's steel grip on the Soviet Union was starting to crumble. The 5-year plan was in shambles, and there was unrest in the vassal states of the Eastern Bloc. So in order to reassert his power and his authority, Stalin turned to a tactic he had used so ruthlessly in the 30s. He started a purge. Dissenters were put on trial. Many would be killed or carted off to prison camps in Siberia. By the time Stalin died in 1953, Soviet oppression had become a way of life. But while Russia sorted out its own problems, paranoia over communism was spreading throughout America. The Red Scare.
Are you a member of the Communist Party, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Ironically, while the Soviets were purging dissenters in Russia, Joseph McCarthy, an obscure senator from Wisconsin, was attempting his own form of purge in the States.
Treason isn't like little topsy. It doesn't just grow. It's created by men with faces and men with names.
In 1947, Truman had instituted loyalty oaths for federal employees. The following year, an American diplomat named Alger Hiss was accused of being a communist spy. As we've now learned through recently declassified Soviet documents, Hiss was, in fact, a Soviet agent. Investigations extended throughout society, including Hollywood.
I've never read Karl Marx, and I don't know the basis of communism beyond what I've picked up from hearsay. What I've heard, I don't like it.
You refuse to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and everything else.
I will match the record of our industry and its contribution to the social welfare against that of any industry in the United States.
And an attempt was made to infiltrate and take over control of that business. And it was a very hurtful time and a violent time in Hollywood.
Do you have any evidence of any kind?
The fact that McCarthy was generally proven to have been a bad man, in a way, settled Americans. It also benefited from the fact that the president at the time was Dwight Eisenhower, someone who was able to calm Americans.
But if Eisenhower helped America survive its political scare, a much more serious threat loomed on the horizon. For 4 years after World War II, the US was the only atomic power on Earth. Then in 1949, the Soviets tested their own atomic weapons. Suddenly the world had two superpowers with competing political agendas.
Americans were really looking for answers because they couldn't understand why they were suddenly in this predicament of feeling that they were being besieged by the Soviet Union, enmeshed in a war in Korea. Suddenly the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons.
In 1950, Americans still possessed 350 warheads, against 5 on the Soviet side. But as the nuclear race accelerated, life at home changed.
The kids in our schools were taught to hide under their desks to avoid nuclear fallout. And, you know, it was a terrible Cold War mentality, and justifiably so, because the arms race kept going like this.
The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma, to devote its entire heart and mind to find the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life.
John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, came up with a new doctrine called mutually assured destruction, based on the powerful ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. I spoke to Ronald Reagan about this policy.
The MAD policy, as it's called, mutual assured destruction. What kind of a defensive policy is that? Is to say that both sides are here, and if one of them starts it, both sides are going to get blown up by nuclear weapons. That kind of a war is a war that can never be won.
What you had in the 1950s was an odd sort of tacit bargain between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Khrushchev basically kept military spending pretty small, but at the same time boasted, we Soviets are the most powerful power on earth. Eisenhower let Khrushchev make those boasts because he knew that if he boasted that way, he wouldn't actually have to spend the rubles on military force, and the United States could stay ahead. And so the result was that the United States very easily maintained its superiority throughout the years of Eisenhower.
But if America was feeling confident in its technological superiority, it received a national wake-up call in 1957 called Sputnik. The Russians had beaten the Americans into space. Despite America...
And now back to Inside the Cold War with Sir David Frost.
On April 12, 1961, the Kennedy White House was suddenly shocked by a major Soviet coup. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had orbited the Earth, the first man to do so. At that moment, however, Kennedy was more focused on communist activities in his own backyard, Castro's Cuba. Kennedy had inherited a plan for the invasion of Cuba, authorized by Eisenhower in the late 1950s. The Bay of Pigs invasion, as it came to be known, required air support by the US. Kennedy was ambivalent about the whole plan, and at the last moment, he cancelled the air support. Cuban forces laid in wait and then defeated the invasion force, killing over 400. It was a major embarrassment for Kennedy. Stunned by Gagarin's triumph and the Bay of Pigs disaster, Kennedy needed a dramatic gesture to throw the Soviets off balance before the Vienna summit in June. He found it in a plan previously rejected to place a man on the moon before 1970.
Choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
But the activities in Berlin and Cuba, directed by Khrushchev, continued to demand Kennedy's attention. Looking back on that era, Presidents Bush and Nixon reminisced about Khrushchev.
He had come to the UN, cracked his shoe on the podium in New York and said, "We're going to bury you." And the free world said, "No, you're not going to bury us."
Khrushchev was boorish, crude, brilliant, ruthless, potentially rash.
On June the 3rd, Kennedy and Khrushchev met face-to-face in Vienna for a two-day summit. On the surface, little was accomplished during the meetings. Indeed, Khrushchev was offended by Kennedy's belligerent stand on issues including Berlin and Cuba. Khrushchev responded by publicly announcing his willingness to revert to nuclear arms if the burning issue of Berlin was not resolved. For years, the Soviet Union had demanded that Berlin be an open city, with all foreign powers removed. But the West feared that Berlin, if left defenseless, would soon be absorbed by Moscow. Throughout the summer of 1961, skilled workers were leaving East Germany in droves. This presented Khrushchev with a problem. And party boss Walter Ulbricht thought he had found a solution, namely to construct a large wall. In August of 1961, Khrushchev gave his blessing, and the dreaded East German militia, the Vopos, went to work. In truth, many in the Kennedy cabinet were quietly relieved at the Soviet action.
Khrushchev abruptly put up the Berlin Wall because he wanted to stop this very big flow of refugees out into the West that was very embarrassing to the Soviet Union. Kennedy didn't like it, but he privately said, better to have a Berlin Wall than a war over Berlin.
And of course, it was an obscene reminder of the Cold War. It was perhaps the most brutal symbol of a division between East and West.
Khrushchev had a big problem because Kennedy had pretty persuasively told the world that despite what Khrushchev is telling you, the Soviets are deeply inferior in military force. In a way, that took away the cloak from Khrushchev, forced Khrushchev to increase defense spending to make it up, and the result was that this led to the arms race of the 1960s.
The Politburo demanded that Khrushchev respond strongly to Kennedy's aggressive posture. Some members even believed that Kennedy was getting ready for a first strike against the Soviet Union.
In the fall of 1962, Kennedy once again was backing something called Operation Mongoose, an effort to overthrow Castro by all sorts of means, perhaps including assassination. This made Castro frantic. Castro leaned on Khrushchev, said, "What can you do to keep the Americans from invading and overthrowing me?" Khrushchev said, "Let's put missiles and nuclear warheads into Cuba. That sure will stop an invasion."
In September, CIA sources first picked up indications that a nuclear deployment was about to take place in Cuba. Kennedy let it be known that any such move would be considered an act of war.
Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday...
In October, U-2 espionage planes captured proof of nuclear missile sites now under construction in Cuba. Khrushchev had thrown down the gauntlet. Kennedy responded.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Everybody involved in all of that miscalculated what the other person was going to do. The 14 people who were involved, who were very, very significant, bright, able, I suppose maybe some of the brightest kind of group that you could get together under those circumstances. If 6 of them had been president of the United States, I think that the world might have been blown up.
In a secret meeting of the Executive Committee at the White House, sentiment was strong for taking immediate action.
And, I mean, there was no question you could have brought it to a head at a much earlier time. And there were those involved in counseling President Kennedy who wanted to do it immediately.
These are excerpts of recently declassified audio tapes of those conversations.
What is the advantage? There must be some major reason for the Russians to set this up as must be that they're not satisfied with their ICBMs.
What it gives them this time really makes the launching base for a short-range missile against the United States to supplement their rather defective ICBM system. But
of course, I don't see how we can prevent further ones coming in by submarine.
It's inconceivable to me that the Soviets would deploy nuclear warheads on an unfenced piece of ground. There must be some storage site there. It should be one of our important objectives to find that storage site.
How many days from tomorrow morning would it, how many mornings during tomorrow morning would it take to take out just these missile sites, which we won't need to know now? How long before we get the information about the rest of the island, do you figure, General?
Reports are that 2 additional SAC missions were executed yesterday. They were taken to Washington area last night. They're currently being chemically processed at the Naval Center at Suitland, and they're due to reach us at the National PI Center around 8 o'clock tonight.
May I suggest we come back this afternoon prepared to answer 3 questions.
But Kennedy opted for a more moderate course. He ordered a naval blockade of the island and wrote to Khrushchev, requesting the immediate dismantling of the sites. Khrushchev wrote back.
Mr. President, the measures indicated in your statement constitute a serious threat to peace and the security of nations. We affirm that the armaments in Cuba are intended solely for defensive purposes.
The crisis grew. American armed forces were raised to high alert status. 14,000 reservists were called up. And meanwhile, Soviet freighters continued to steam towards American Navy ships.
Where are you going to intercept a particular vessel? Where are you going to let that vessel go through? I mean, the whole idea, for instance, President Kennedy spent more time trying to give the Soviet Union time to calculate their position than to get the missiles out of Cuba.
Secret negotiations were conducted between Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin. Kennedy would need to agree to withdraw American missile sites in Turkey which, unlike the Cuban missiles, had already become operational. The deal was confirmed in a formal letter by Khrushchev to Kennedy. As U.S. aircraft were poised to launch their strike on Cuba, Kennedy confirmed his acceptance. The terms of the deal were kept secret.
I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba, dismantling offensive weapons, returning them to the Soviet Union under UN verification. This is an important and constructive contribution to peace.
Even though the Soviet Union had gained major concessions, the Kennedy administration heralded the withdrawal as a major victory for the West. In Moscow, the Politburo was furious.
Khrushchev was content to sneak the missiles and the weapons into Cuba as a propaganda gesture to suggest to the world that the Soviets were winning the Cold War, but he wasn't crazy enough to do that with the intention of causing a third world war that would be nuclear, that could mean the death of much of the life on this planet.
From that moment, the days of Khrushchev were numbered. Meanwhile, President Kennedy emerged from the episode convinced, more than ever, of the Russian threat to world peace.
We now know from Soviet documents that we haven't had access to until very recently that there were dozens of nuclear weapons in Cuba. That's something that Kennedy could not be sure of at the time.
Early in his presidency, Kennedy had sent military advisors to Vietnam. On November the 1st, 1963, Kennedy received news that President Diem of South Vietnam had been assassinated in a military coup. The Cold War was about to move to Southeast Asia.
Inside the Cold War with Sir David Frost will continue.
In the eyes of the Kremlin, the Vietnam syndrome had left the Americans open to what were communist victories in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Angola. Now, the election of a moderate Democrat, Jimmy Carter, to the presidency, convinced Brezhnev that America would continue with its policy of détente at almost all costs. In Europe, the Soviet Union was prepared to comply. But outside of Europe, the Soviet Union launched what was perhaps the biggest offensive of the whole Cold War, the war for the Third World. In the amazingly short span of 20 months, the Soviets and the Cubans would become militarily involved in Ethiopia, Yemen, Nicaragua, Grenada, El Salvador, and finally, Afghanistan. Détente clearly did not deter Soviet expansionism. I sat down in Atlanta with President Jimmy Carter to discuss the question of using military force to stop aggression.
I was deeply committed philosophically and I hope logically to the proposition that our tremendous political and military power should not be exerted through the use of military force. Part of this conviction of mine was induced, or strengthened at least, by the then recent experiences in Vietnam. So whenever I was faced with that sort of choice, I refrained from using military force and tried to substitute for it a more intense application of diplomacy.
Carter remained committed to diplomacy, denying military support to Somalia, even when they were under duress by Soviet-backed Ethiopia. Instead, he initiated dialogue between Egypt and Israel, which had been almost non-existent since the 1973 October War. The following year, President Carter invited both leaders to Washington.
Before I went to Camp David with Begin and Sadat, I understood the issues involved. I didn't have to turn around to my Secretary of State and say, tell me where the Sinai Desert is, or who are the Palestinians, you know, things. I knew those answers to begin with.
At Camp David, Carter, Sadat, and Begin hammered out an agreement between those two arch-enemies. On March the 25th, 1979, the Camp David Accords were signed at the White House, a high point for Carter's diplomacy. Then came two surprises. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And Americans were taken hostage in Iran.
I recognize that all of your goals are not ever going to be reached, and then you have unforeseen circumstances that you never anticipate. The most notable one during my 4 years was a revolution in Iran. We were trying to build a relationship with the revolutionary government and making some progress, but it was only totally frustrated when our hostages were taken.
The afterglow of Carter's Middle East success was short-lived. With the Soviets entrenched in Afghanistan, Carter froze negotiations on the SALT II treaty and then withdrew American athletes from the 1980 Moscow Olympic Games. In his last months in office, the hostage crisis in Iran dragged on and was only finally resolved as Ronald Reagan was sworn into office. Détente seemed dead. Cold War tensions were higher than ever. In this climate of conflict, Reagan had swept to victory with a mandate to stop Soviet aggression.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
Historians now say that Reagan came into office at the most dangerous phase of the Cold War. For months, KGB director Yuri Andropov had been telling the Kremlin that America was preparing for a preemptive strike. I spoke to President Reagan about America's military buildup during that first term.
When I took office, on any given day, fully half of our aircraft could not fly for lack of spare parts. The defense forces had been so whittled down by the government taking what should have been their money for their budget and using it on programs that of their particular liking.
Adding to the tension was the Solidarity movement in Poland. Led by Lech Walesa, the movement used strikes by Gdansk shipyard workers throughout 1980 to demand democratic reforms. On March the 28th, 1981, the Kremlin responded by closing the airspace over Poland, anticipating a new strike. But at the last moment, the Solidarity strike was postponed and the Soviets held back their tanks. Meanwhile, superpower tension shifted to Central America. In Nicaragua in 1979, Marxist Sandinistas had seized power from the corrupt dictator Anastasio Somoza. Reagan searched for ways to support the so-called Contras in their efforts against the Sandinistas. When Congress cut funding for the Contras, the Reagan administration went looking elsewhere for the funds, as was revealed during Oliver North's congressional testimony. I asked Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office how these sales occurred.
To this day, after all the investigations, I'm still waiting for an answer. Who raised the price to these individuals for the arms? Who got the extra money? And where did the extra money go?
Despite congressional setbacks, Ronald Reagan presented the case to the American public that the Soviets had gained military superiority in the Cold War.
Another example of what's happened. By the end of 1979, when Soviet leader Brezhnev declared a balance now exists, the Soviets had over 800 warheads. We still had none. A year ago this month, Mr. Brezhnev pledged a moratorium or freeze on SS-20 deployment. But by last August, their 800 warheads had become more than 1,200. We still had none, some freeze.
Reagan claimed that the balance of power had tipped to the Soviets, so he proposed a new high-tech space defense system, soon nicknamed Star Wars.
I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles.
With tensions already high between the Soviet Union and the United States, a Korean airliner left Alaska on September the 1st, 1983, bound for Korea. For a brief time, an American reconnaissance plane was in the vicinity. President Reagan explains.
At no time was the RC-135 in Soviet airspace. The Korean airliner flew on, and the two planes were soon widely separated. The Soviets scrambled jet interceptors from a base in Sakhalin Island. Japanese ground sites recorded the interceptor plane's radio transmissions. He says he has locked on the radar, which aims his missiles, has launched those missiles. The target has been destroyed, and he is breaking off the attack. It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life, and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations.
Reagan struck back. He launched an invasion of Grenada, the small Marxist nation in the Caribbean, where a coup threatened the safety of some 1,000 American students.
Grenada operation was top secret all the way until the night before, when I notified the congressional leaders that our troops were on their way. And yes, there were a small number of deaths there. There could be, but that mission was so successful in just a few days. And my greatest reward came when I was watching on television as some of the young medical students came back to the United States. And they were what we were in there to rescue. And you saw them get off the airplanes and kneel down and kiss the tarmac, and it kind of made it well worthwhile.
Reagan's actions sent a new signal to the Kremlin, but the Soviet attitude had hardened. From 1980 to 1985, arms negotiations had all but stopped, and the Soviets were busy in Afghanistan. The Reagan administration supported the determined resistance force known as the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles, limiting the use of Soviet tactical helicopters. Meanwhile, in 1984, Libya, a key Soviet ally, bombed the Sudanese broadcast station in Khartoum, then set about mining the Gulf of Suez. Reagan responded by attacking Libyan patrol boats. In response, Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi allegedly planted a bomb in a West Berlin disco frequented by American GIs. Reagan retaliated with force, bombing several sites in Libya, including Gaddafi's residence. America's years of restraint seemed to be over, and for the remainder of the Cold War, Libya curbed its aggression. In the Kremlin, things were changing. Leonid Brezhnev died in 1983 and was succeeded as premier by Yuri Andropov. 18 months later, Andropov died and was replaced by Konstantin Chernenko, who died less than a year later. Facing a near collapse of their economy, the Politburo gambled, and on March the 11th, 1985, elevated its youngest member to the post. His name, of course, was Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev.
We now return to Inside the Cold War.
The emergence of Mikhail Gorbachev brought a new type of Soviet presence to the world stage. Former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher described her first meeting with Gorbachev.
I invited him to Chequers on a Sunday, and when I was asked by the press afterwards, I said, yes, this is a man I can do business with. We can do business with.
On February the 25th, 1986, Gorbachev opened the 27th Communist Party Congress. Perestroika, a policy of free market initiatives, was proposed, along with glasnost, new openness throughout Soviet life. He shocked the Politburo and the world. In October 1986, President Reagan met face-to-face with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland, to continue disarmament talks. Gorbachev stunned the Americans by proposing to do away with all offensive nuclear weapons in both their arsenals. This could mean the end of the Cold War, but Gorbachev's proposal required the US to cancel the Star Wars Space Defense Initiative. Reagan felt blindsided, and the Americans broke off the talks. Do you still look back about Reykjavik and think, if only we nearly did it? Do you think that about Reykjavik?
No, by no means, not at all. When George Shultz at the military base in Reykjavik said that this was a fiasco, a failure, I addressed 900 journalists in Reykjavik and told them that this was a breakthrough. Of course, our relationship did have its different periods. We had some fierce, hectic debates, but there was a growing amount of trust.
4 months later, Gorbachev's proposal to reduce intermediate nuclear forces was signed, with no concession required on Star Wars. By June '87, and the speech in Berlin, President Reagan believed the Soviet Empire was permanently weakened.
Come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Berlin speech would come to be seen as a crowning moment in Reagan's presidency. While the White House transitioned from Reagan to Bush, it was nothing like the transition about to hit Europe.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute...
Totalitarian era is passing. Its old ideas blown away like leaves from an ancient, lifeless tree.
This conversation with President Bush took place in Maine during his first summer in office.
The American position of this president, and I believe of the vast majority in Congress, is we want perestroika to succeed. We want glasnost to continue. And I have sent that signal to Mr. Gorbachev over and over again. I'm sure he understands that.
Do you think that in your time the Berlin Wall will be dismantled?
Yep.
You've asked for it and you think...
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
But on the whole, the pace that we created was too fast for society to catch up with.
Events in 1989 happened rapidly. In February, Gorbachev ordered Soviet troops to withdraw from Afghanistan. The Soviets' Vietnam was over. In Poland, Solidarity won the first free elections since World War II. Demonstrators demanded reforms throughout Eastern Europe. Gorbachev refused to intervene. To the contrary, he chose Egon Krenz, a moderate, to replace Erich Honecker in East Germany. And so we return to Berlin. But this time, the tables were turned. In his first day in office, Egon Krenz discovered that the DDR was virtually bankrupt. It owed $26 billion to West Germany for trade credits, granted in return for a relaxation of some of the DDR's emigration laws. Egon Krenz thought there was a way that he could solve this problem by offering a new package to Chancellor Kohl. But no way. The train had left the station. Chancellor Kohl was dreaming the impossible dream by now, the prospect of a German reunification. November the 9th, 1989. After relentless public demonstrations, Krenz agreed to reform the border crossing law. No details are given to the East Berlin border guards. The border guards are confused. Crowds begin to gather on both sides. A groundswell of people power presses against the East German side of the wall. The Vopos do not dare to stop them. In the confusion, the wall opens.
And it clearly is a good development in terms of human rights.
In Czechoslovakia, the revolution continued. In late December, dissident playwright Václav Havel was named president. Country by country, the Eastern Bloc was collapsing. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, East Germany, Albania, and finally Yugoslavia. The changes brought about by Gorbachev were breathtaking, but some could not tolerate the reform. On November the 7th, an assassin aimed a shotgun at Gorbachev. At the last second, the shots were deflected into the air by a guard. Gorbachev survived unscathed, and the event went largely unreported in the West. With hardliners lurking in the shadows, the forces of freedom were now focused on the Soviet Union itself. Russia, led by Boris Yeltsin, announced in June 1990 that it would become a sovereign nation. Later that month, Bush and Gorbachev met in Washington for one of the last Soviet-American summits of the Cold War. Several agreements were signed, including new limitations on chemical weapons. Then, on August the 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The next day, Moscow and Washington issued a joint statement condemning the Iraqi invasion. It was a startling development, marking the first time since World War II that the US and the Soviet Union were perceived as allies. While a war was being fought in the Iraqi desert, events in Europe continued at breakneck pace. On March the 31st, 1991, the Warsaw Pact was officially dissolved. On May the 20th, the Supreme Soviet passed a law guaranteeing the right to travel abroad and emigrate. That spring, Georgia declared its independence. The rest of the Soviet Union followed. The empire was crumbling. Then suddenly, on June the 20th, the US ambassador in Moscow warned Gorbachev of a conspiracy against him. Hints of trouble were apparent even as President Bush paid a visit to Moscow on July the 30th, meeting with Gorbachev and separately with Boris Yeltsin. The heat Gorbachev had been feeling was about to reach boiling point. The last act of the Cold War was played out here, behind the walls of the Kremlin in the last 6 months of 1991, as Air Force One lifted off USSR soil for the last time. Gorbachev turned to an even more momentous task, the task of signing a Union treaty that would consign the old Soviet Union to never being a superpower again. Now, some of Gorbachev's ministers felt they had a patriotic duty to preempt this accord and to preempt it at all costs. Amidst the confusion of rapidly unfolding events, Mikhail Gorbachev departed for a vacation on the Crimean Sea. There, on August the 18th, and in Moscow, a group of hardliners attempted a coup d'etat. I asked him if his life had been in danger during those chilling events. Just those 3 days in the Black Sea in the Crimea, when you were under arrest, I mean, I suppose there was danger then.
Well, I told my family there and then that I said, anything may happen. Anything may happen. I said, there might be some attempts to provoke me into taking some unthought of steps to kill me on the spot, like to provoke me into starting a shootout or something. I said that what might happen was that I would not just be isolated, but I would be taken away someplace. And I said to my family that you, my family, have to be prepared that anything may happen. And this indeed could have happened.
Who had the nuclear codes? Did you have them with you, or did the coup plotters in Moscow actually have the nuclear codes in Moscow?
In Moscow. The coup plotters had them in Moscow.
So that the plotters for 3 days had that power. Terrifying. When Gorbachev returned to Moscow, the nation and the Soviet Empire were in disarray. Boris Yeltsin was growing in power.
Мировом сообществе возвращает нас к эпохе холодной войны и изоляции Советского Союза с мирового сообщества.
On December the 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. As he did so, the evil empire was no more.
And so, with the Cold War well and truly over, what are we left with?
John le Carré, perhaps the most celebrated Cold War novelist, sums it up like this. It was man who ended the Cold War, in case you didn't notice. Not just weaponry or technology. It was just man, not even Western man either, as it happened, but our sworn enemy in the East, who went into the streets, faced the bullets and the batons, and said, "We've had enough." It was their emperor, not ours, who had the nerve to mount the rostrum and declare he had no clothes. The ideologies trailed after these events like condemned prisoners, as ideologies do when they've had their day.
One thing is certain. Unlike war, peace cannot be won. It has to be fought for, one day at a time. And the same goes for freedom. Goodbye for now.